Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is our Season 6 finale. I'll be taking the next 2 Sundays off, the 31st and the 7th of April. Next week is Easter anyway, which I do celebrate, so it kind of works out. I'll be back 3 weeks from the release date of this episode on April the 14th, 2024. That's going to go by quickly. If you've just discovered us, this is a great time to binge and catch up on what you missed. I'm excited for Season 7. I have some great solo ideas ready to go, and a few guests lined up. Should be great. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for your support, your kind words, your emails, all the shout outs on social media, the 5-star reviews. It's greatly appreciated. Now, believe it or not, there are some chess players who have not discovered us yet. Hard to believe, but it's true. So if you would tell your chess playing friends, tell your buddies at the chess club, we would appreciate it. Spread the word. Word of mouth is always the most valuable way of getting the word out. So we appreciate it. Let people know. Also, I definitely want your input on topics for the podcast. If there's a topic you're interested in, I can pretty much guarantee you that others are too. You can email me directly, info@thechessangle.com, or you can click the contact link on our website, thechessangle.com, and message that way. You can even leave a voicemail on the website if you want. You don't have to. You can, of course, message us the old-fashioned way, but that option is available. And remember, our website has been completely overhauled. In addition to topic ideas for the pod, you can also send general questions, and I can include them in our listener mailbag segment. Bottom line, I definitely want to hear from all of you, the listeners. And as always, there is a link for our email address and website in the show notes. So now let's get to the meat of this week's episode, our content, 10 ways to lose a chess game. This was an episode I was thinking about. I was going to call it How to Lose a Chess Game in 10 Ways, but then that sounded a little, so I changed it to 10 Ways to Lose a Chess Game. That's sort of where the title came from. But this is something I've been kicking around for a while. And here's the thing. These 10 things I'm going to mention, which generally lead to a losing game, they're based not only on my own games, but on the hundreds, really thousands of amateur games I've seen at the club. I've seen many, many games at the Long Island Chess Club over the years. And these mistakes happen over and over again with alarming consistency. Most of these I still either struggle with myself or I constantly have to remind myself. I think they happen at all levels. I mean, certainly for GMs at that level, it happens in a different way, so to speak, but I think it still happens. But at our level, these things happen in a very simple way and in a very overt way, and they happen all the time. So I'm basing this, again, not only on my own games and my own struggles and things I deal with, but on the thousands of games I've seen at the club. This stuff just happens over and over. So I thought I would just do sort of a top 10. Think of it as the top 10 reasons why players lose a chess game. Maybe they're not the top 10 ways, but they're up there and they're important and they happen all the time. So let's go through these. These aren't really in a particular order as far as importance. It's more of the way the game goes. It's kind of like opening, middle game, end game, sort of, kind of. These aren't really in a set order. I just organized them in a way that the next one sort of follows the one that came before it, that type of thing. So let's jump in. So number 1, after your opponent moves, you're focused more on your own response than processing the move he just made and assessing threats. You're so concerned about what you're going to do, you really haven't processed your opponent's ideas. It sort of reminds me of that quote from Stephen Covey. He wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he talks about how people are poor listeners and poor communicators. He says, most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Right? So true. You're talking to somebody and he or she is so focused on what they're going to say and what, how they're going to respond rather than processing what you just said. And I think it's true for chess games as well. You're so concerned about your ideas that you don't say, wait a minute, he just moved. I have to process that first. And you end up rushing or playing impulsively or playing thoughtlessly, or you get lazy, you don't analyze, and you just bang out your own move, right? So after your opponent moves, you really have to assess the threats. Now, the difference between good players and bad players, and I've spoken about this before, the good players will know when your opponent's move really does carry a threat or if it's just a quote unquote threat. Is it really a threat or is it an apparent threat? A good player will know that it's an apparent threat. It's really not a threat at all, and he can carry on with his own plans. Whereas weaker players will look at every threat and just assume that it's legitimate rather than realize it's not threatening anything at all. But the bottom line is, before you think of your own moves, you really have to process your opponent's move first. And too many players do that superficially or not at all. In other words, they're just gunning, they're chomping at the bit to play their own move, that they don't stop and process what their opponent just played. And they often don't realize that their opponent's move does not allow you to carry out the plan that you want. That's certainly very frustrating, but that's part of the game. And sometimes you have to adjust and pivot. So you really need to process your opponent's move before you start thinking of your own. Again, it's the chess version of most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. It's the same thing in chess, very, very common. Now, along those lines, but it is a bit different. Number 2 is when players rush in an unfamiliar or unconventional opening. That is, your opponent plays an odd opening move. It could be move 1 or maybe shortly after, maybe move 2, 3, or 4. It's an odd opening move, and you don't stop and think and assess if there's a trap or something you need to deal with. Similar to number 1, but this is specifically related to the opening. I'm reminded as a London system player, there's that well-known trap where after d4, d5, bishop f4, black plays h4. And if white plays e3 right away, it actually traps the dark squared bishop. It's a very common London system trap. A lot of guys use it in blitz. That's just one example off the top of my head. But if you're a London player, it's easy to dismiss it as just some sort of impulsive, aggressive move, like he's starting a premature attack, when in fact, it can trap your bishop if you go on autopilot and play quote unquote normally. So when your opponent plays an unfamiliar or unsound opening move, even though it seems strange, and it very well may be strange, and it very well may be incorrect and theoretically wrong, you really have to stop and assess it, because we're not computers, right? A computer is going to know it's wrong right away and find the right move. But it might take us as humans longer to find the correct refutation. But often we just dismiss it as just some silly opening move. I can just carry on with my normal opening and do whatever I want. You really can't. And it may seem sort of like an ego thing, because if you take more time, you're sort of letting your opponent dictate the pace of the game. But that's how it goes. When your opponent plays a very, very strange or unusual move, like on, move 3, 4, 5, something like that, you really have to stop and think, because if you just sort of bang out a response, you can really, really get into trouble. All right. And some players actually play in that way. In other words, as black, they'll deliberately, or even as white, it really doesn't matter what color they have, they'll play these odd moves knowing that many players are just going to rush the response and then they'll get an advantage. They sort of play off of that. They expect that. They hope for that. So you really have to be aware of that and kind of say, no, I'm not going to let you dictate the game. I'm going to take my time. And then when you play properly and respond properly, what ends up happening is, because that move really wasn't good, they end up with a worse position. But you have to take your time in order for that to happen and for you to have the better position and realize that that move is a mistake. So in other words, don't just whip out a response real quick when your opponent plays an unusual opening move within the first 5 or 6 moves. Very, very important. Number 3 is an oldie but goodie, but I see it all the time, and that is neglecting development, often because you're launching an unsound or premature attack, right? So you have 2 pieces that point towards your opponent's king, and you think you're going to start this swashbuckling attack, when the truth is you don't have enough of your army in the game. Happens all the time. Neglecting development. You have to know when it's time to attack and when it's time to develop. And these sort of premature attacks are very, very common. you neglect castling, you don't get your pieces off their original squares, or you just don't develop properly. Development is not just simply moving the pieces off of their original squares, but getting them off of their original squares with a purpose. All right, maybe you're controlling a certain square, or you're looking to prevent control of a certain square, whatever it is. Usually there's a plan involved. Like, for example, if black plays knight f6, usually he'll follow up with b6 and bishop b7 because you're controlling e4, that type of thing. Your pieces should work in harmony. But very often, players just sort of mindlessly move them off the original squares, or, again, very common, they'll start a premature attack. And they don't have the strength for it, and then what happens is they end up getting a worse position after their opponent refutes the attack, which should never have been launched in the first place. Just get your pieces out. Don't be impatient. I mean, you'll notice a lot of these, like the first three so far, and even some of the ones coming up, a lot of this has to do with impatience. It's such a huge, huge thing, right? And what's that old quote? I'm blanking on who said it, but anyway, it's impatience is the main reason for losing a game or drawing a game that should have been won. I think it was Bent Larson. I'll have to look that up. But great quote, right? Impatience is the main reason for losing a game or drawing a game that should have been won. So true. And the first three things I'm mentioning really has to do with impatience. It all falls under that umbrella. Number 4, and again, this still has to do with impatience, a little bit of lazy thinking. Number 4 is castling thoughtlessly or because you can, right? There's a famous GM or a famous book, I forget which one, where he talks about castling because you can, right? Well, I didn't castle yet. There are no pieces between my king and rook, so I'm going to castle simply because I can castle. But it might be incorrect because you're castling into an attack, or because it's tactically flawed after you castle. He can win a piece or a pawn, something like that. And along those lines, many players misplay opposite side castling. Right now, with opposite side castling, of course, it often becomes a battle because you're each attacking on the other side, right? You can move your pawns to attack your opponent's king with opposite side castling because the pawns you're moving are not the ones in front of your king, right? And it often becomes a race. But many players, they don't interpret correctly, should I attack or should I defend? I mean, it's a mix. Very often with opposite side castling, when your opponent's coming for your king, the correct response is just to go after his king. Like, you don't need to defend. You might need to, but you really, really need to stop and analyze. And many players don't do that. They completely misplay it. But let's go back to the first part. So castling thoughtlessly or simply because you can simply means you don't analyze the position in your head after you castle. Okay, so you castle, you have to picture your king and rook in the new position, and that's hard for players to visualize sometimes. And even stronger players mess that up, where they'll castle and then they'll fall victim to like a knight fork or something like that. Or they'll castle and then they fall victim to a mating threat because they don't realize that by putting their king in the corner, let's say h7 or whatever it is not defended enough, something like that. Or they can do like a bishop sacrifice. There are some lines in the French defense, for example, in the advanced variation, where black will not castle for quite some time or even the whole game. Because what happens in the advanced variation, the center is locked. And so your king can often be safe in the center for quite some time, or it can even move up to like e7 to connect the rooks that way. Because remember, I know every book is like you have to castle, it's important, but that's generally for open games like e4, e5, or even d4, d5, where the center can open up easily. But in certain positions, such as, again, the advanced French, where the center is locked, it's often better to not castle to keep your king in the center because nothing can attack it there. All right. And then when white advances that pawn and you castle kingside, he can sometimes start an attack. I mean, not always. Usually it's correct to castle in the French, even in the advance, but you got to assess the situation. There are times where the rook will stay on the H file and black will go H5 in the French. It really depends. But again, this is what I mean about doing it thoughtlessly. You really have to analyze this and think it through. With opposite side castling, where it's often a race and both sides are sort of attacking each other like crazy, you have to assess, do I continue my own attack or do I defend? It's kind of a mixture of both. And it can be annoying to do that kind of analysis because it's really frustrating. You know, those positions where it's like your opponent's attacking you and it's like, do I defend or do I ignore it and carry out my attack? You know, and then you have to analyze. You really got to spend time on that. But many players castle without thinking, right? Or they misplay the opposite side castling because they're not analyzing thoroughly enough. You really need to take your time with that. Number 5 is moving a rook to the center or any file really for no reason, just to simply do it, right? Well, I need to move the rook somewhere, so let me just move it to the center. Now, this is okay occasionally as a waiting move if you're really stumped and you don't want to force things and blunder. But many players do these types of rook moves almost habitually. They simply just move a rook to a file, but they haven't really processed why they're moving it there. Now, I spoke about waiting moves in a previous episode. Like if you're really, really stuck and you don't want to blunder, sometimes you can't do this as your overall style, but sometimes, yeah, those kind of moves are good, but you just sort of shuffle a rook or shuffle a bishop because you're afraid anything else might be a blunder. And you know, you'd rather play like a passive move that doesn't blunder than try to force something because it seems more active and then it's a blunder. I get it. And occasionally that's okay. But as I was saying, many players do this all the time, like every game. They simply just move a rook to a file just because they feel good moving the rook, but it either doesn't belong there, there's a much better idea, or there's another file that the rook should be at, which makes a lot more sense. So you really have to analyze, you know, why am I moving my rook to this file? Is that file going to open up? You know, am I going to be able to open it up? Is he going to open it up? Is it defending an important piece? Or is it just sitting there doing nothing? You don't want to make that a habitual part of your game, but many players do. And number 6, the 6th reason why many players lose a chess game is what they call too much French pastry. That's an old school basketball term, I believe, for getting too fancy. Right? In chess, that's where you create unnecessary complications and you get a little too cute with your moves, right? You get in your own way, or you try to emulate something you saw in a book that doesn't quite fit the particular position in front of you. That's very, very common. You see some crazy tactical shot in a book and you think that you can use it with the position in front of you and you can't. And you just try to get too fancy and you get in your own way and you complicate things and you end up with a losing position when you could have played much more simply and won the game that way. So you try too hard and you mix things up a little too much. Now, I know the advice about when you play higher rated players, it's always good to do that because if you play book moves, they're going to outplay you because they know those positions, you know, and I get it. And I generally agree with that. But what I'm saying is there's a little bit of an overcorrection there. People take it too far. They just get too complicated for their knowledge and ability, and they end up getting in this position where they just get crushed when they didn't need to. So don't overcomplicate things unless you absolutely have to, unless you're completely losing and you need to pull a swindle, something like that. But what many players do is the position is pretty much equal or close to equal, maybe someone slightly better, and they go into these complications unnecessarily. There's no reason for them to do it, and they end up losing the game. Number 7 is trading down into a losing king and pawn ending. That one's big and it's very common. Now, sure, when you trade down, it could be drawn, but many times those exchanges are decisive. I used to have a lot of long conversations with National Master Rob Guevara from Long Island, good friend. He was on the podcast. And after rounds back in the day, this was back maybe like 2008, 2009, like when the club was new, we would talk a lot after the rounds. And he would always say that. He would always say, whenever you go into a king and pawn ending, many, many times one side is better. But what a lot of amateur players do is they think, oh, okay, I'm going to trade down our final two pieces. You know, it's even. I can probably draw. So they have a knight, their opponent has a bishop, they trade. But what they didn't do was analyze the position once the trades are done. And as we know, all it takes is just one little square. Your opponent just has to have the jump, you know, one tempo with his king. That's it. One square, one tempo, and he's winning the game, right? Because in a king and pawn ending, the way that you win is by queening a pawn, right? And if you have the opposition where you need to, or you just have, that one square where you get the jump where you can penetrate into your opponent's position and he can't defend it, then you're winning. But many, many players simply trade down and they think just because they trade down, well, we each have kings and pawns, right? It has to be drawn. No, it really depends on where your king is, but players don't analyze the position after the pieces are traded down. It's the old real estate rule, right? Like if you buy a house or really a business, they say, what's the most important thing with real estate, right? Location, location, location. What's the most important thing with a king and pawn ending? Location, 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 right? Where your king is after the trades is going to be huge. Now, again, it could be drawn. And if you're looking for a draw and you analyze it and you realize, okay, if we trade down, this is a dead drawn ending, fine. But many players don't do that or they misassess it. And then once they trade down, they're winning. I mean, I've done this many, many times where a player will offer me a trade because what happens is, let's face it, it's the end game. Both players are in time pressure and they get nervous. And what's the knee-jerk reaction when you're in time pressure and it's the end game? You want to just trade, right? I don't know what to do, right? My clock's ticking, tick, tick. I don't know what to do. Oh, let me trade pieces. And then so often they'll offer me the trade and I'll realize that if I go into this trade, I'm going to win the game. And a lot of that comes with experience and just knowing these endings. Like fortunately, many times, if I'm in time pressure also, I've seen enough of these that I know immediately if I trade down, my king will have the better position, right? Against a weaker player, you can get away with that. But really, really analyze those trades and really see that, okay, if we go into a king and pawn ending, am I going to be losing? And many players do that incorrectly and they end up losing the game. Number 8 is trying too hard to win. Players are most likely to fall into this trap against a lower-rated opponent who's playing well, and you're in a dead-drawn endgame. This sort of goes along with number 7. Now, let's face it, it's very, very frustrating when you want to win and the position is completely dead. Like it's almost the type of position where it's almost impossible for either player to blunder, right? The position is that dead drawn. But if you really want the win, let's say the point is going to get you in a standing for a prize, or it's going to have you win the tournament, or if it's a much lower rated opponent and you know that a draw is going to lose you some points, it's very frustrating when you're burning, you have this burning desire to get the win, but it's just a dead drawn position. So many players, they will just try to force things because they do not want to draw. They do not want to lose. And in these types of positions, I mean, sure, you can play on and hope that your opponent makes a mistake. But if you try to force things and try too hard and then you make a mistake, your opponent is going to find that. I mean, your best bet, if you absolutely insist on the win, you're just going to have to really grind it out, just cat and mouse, just keep playing these, nothing moves. I mean, if you really can't find a winning idea, just kind of milk it and hope your opponent blunders. But if he doesn't, and he's not falling for that, you're going to have to concede that, okay, this is a draw, and you're going to have to tip your hat to your opponent that he's playing well. Because I've seen it so many times. I've done it myself. You just try too hard to win. No, I can win this. You're stubborn. And then you play that one forcing move, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute. No, that's a mistake. He can do this. And then boom, you lose the game. Right? And it's not so much that your opponent won. It's that you lost just because you forced things. And trust me, I know it's really, really annoying when you don't just want to agree to a draw and you really want the win. But as I said, sometimes you're just going to have to tip your hat and say your opponent played well and there's nothing I can do. Now, if you really insist on the win, that's fine, but you're going to be there all night. I mean, you're going to be there for a while shuffling pieces, and it may end up being, just the 50 move rule or something like that, like if the pawns are locked. But that's how it goes. Speaking of lower rated players, number 9 is losing your edge and sense of danger against lower rated opponents. And this is something that I still struggle with. That is, many players have trouble handling the psychology of playing low rated opponents. I spoke with Nick Weissel at length about this when he was on the podcast. Still a big issue for me. Like, if I'm being honest, I'll draw or beat like an 1800 player, and then I'll lose to a 1200, right? Not all the time, but more often than I should. And I'm reminded of the expression check your ego at the door. I was watching recently, just a little side note, but it sort of relates to this. The next time you're on Netflix, check out The Greatest Night in Pop. It's a documentary on the making of the We Are the World from 84, 85, whatever it was. It's absolutely fascinating. Those of you who are my age, who are old enough to remember We Are the World, yeah, it's basically a documentary on the recording of that. They did it in one night. They did it overnight. They started whatever it was, like 11 at night, and they finished at 6 in the morning. So this was all done in one night, the entire recording. It's absolutely fascinating. Now you may say, why are you mentioning this documentary? Because when you watch it, you could see that they had a sign in the studio that said, check your ego at the door, because not everyone was given a solo, and everybody probably wanted to be featured, but they couldn't. And that's what you need to do. I know I need to do this at the club. You need to check your ego at the door, especially when you play low-rated opponents, because it's very easy to get frustrated against them when they're doing well, or somehow you don't take the game as serious. It's a big issue, and it's something I struggle with as well. I have more trouble playing like a 1200 player than a 2000 player. I still struggle with this. I haven't fully figured it out, which is kind of sad, but we all have our Achilles heel. We all have our weaknesses, and that's mine, where I sometimes lose my sense of danger against a low-rated opponent. Not all the time, but as I said, it happens often enough that I still consider it a problem for me. So when I saw this in this documentary, that little sign in the studio that said, check your ego at the door, I don't know if Quincy Jones put it up, who kind of ran the whole thing, but it kind of reminded me of that. I need to do that at the club. Just check your ego at the door. Just play, take everybody seriously. Don't get caught up in rating and how many points you are or are not going to get, which is hard to do, because the fact that we have ratings, it sort of lends itself to that type of thinking. But it's something to think about. All right. So you don't want to lose your edge or sense of danger against a low-rated opponent. And I know that's not a problem just for me. I see this all the time at the club, where many players will play a worse game against a low-rated opponent than a higher-rated one. It's quite fascinating, the psychology of that, but it's something you definitely need to be aware of. And finally, number 10, players don't adapt to the time control. They don't adapt the amount of time they take per move in their thought process to the time control. That is, you cannot play a club level control such as game 90 delay 10 or game 75 delay 10. You can't play that the way you would a major weekend classical control, such as 40 moves in 120 minutes with a 30-second delay. In other words, if someone invites you to play football, you don't bring a baseball bat with you, right? You have to adjust to the time control. You can't play them the same way. So let's break this down, because there's a number of things to unpack here. For club level controls, which obviously are shorter, game 60, game 75, game 90. Now, as a side note, I would not recommend playing shorter than game 90. Like those game 60s, those game 75s, I think those can be dangerous. That's a separate discussion. But anyway, I know that might not, that might be unavoidable, because if the only club in your area uses those controls, if the choice is between playing and not playing, I get it. But anyway, for those club time controls, the game 60s, the game 75s, the game 90s, you cannot take like 7 to 8 minutes on several moves. In other words, you can't take 7 to 8 minutes on a move, like 3 or 4 moves in a row, because you are going to get into time pressure. And you're not going to have time to calculate in those critical endgame moments. And that's where the blunders happen, like I said earlier. Well, you'll trade down into a losing king and pawn endgame simply because, your clock was about to run out of time. That type of thing. Now, for the slow classical controls, like in the major weekend events, take your time, yes, but you can also overdo it. There can actually be an overcorrection. And this is generally a problem for people who are consistently in time trouble, where time pressure is a constant problem for them and they haven't fixed it yet. In other words, for many players who get into time trouble all the time, a slower time control doesn't help them. They overcorrect from their weekly club control. It's like smoke in a room, right? The smoke's going to fill the room, whether it's a small room or a big room, the smoke's going to fill the room. There's something called Parkinsons Law of time management. This is the idea that work expands to fill the time allotted for its completion, right? So if a worker has 2 weeks to complete a task, it's going to take 2 weeks, right? But if you tell the worker, okay, you have 48 hours to complete the task, he or she'll do it in 48 hours, right? The work's going to expand to fill the time allotted for it. I think of my middle school kids. If I give them a project, let's say I know it should only take them 2 class sessions. If I say, okay, you only have 2 class sessions for this, they're going to take 2 class sessions to do it. But if I say, you know what, you have 5 class sessions to do this, even though I know it should only take 2. If I say to them, you have 5 class sessions to do this, they're going to take 5 class sessions to do it, right? The work's going to expand to fill the time allotted for its completion. That's Parkinson's Law of time management. And it's true in chess as well. So in other words, players prone to time trouble need to be aware of the clock even in slow classical controls because of Parkinson's Law. They'll take more time on a move than they should because they think, oh, it's a classical control. I got all this time. But again, it's that whole smoke in the room theory, right? And then they overcorrect for it. And even in the slower time controls, they still get in time pressure because they didn't adjust, right? You have to adjust based on the time control that you're playing, or they adjust too much from their club control. Right? You can't play a 40 move and 2 hour game like a game 60, but it's not like you can take, a half hour on every move. Yes, your time is there to use, but you need to make sure you have enough time left on your clock to win the game. So I just think that's an interesting psychological way of looking at things as far as time pressure, because it's my firm belief that players who get into time pressure all the time, lengthening the time control doesn't always help them with time pressure, again, because of Parkinson's Law of time management, right? Because the time that they have is just going to fill to expand, right? That whole thing. Very interesting. If you're interested in the Parkinson's Law of time management, you can Google it. It's all over the internet. I think it's fascinating both in life and in chess as well. But when it comes to getting into time pressure and not adapting properly to the time control, I think Parkinson's Law really is a major factor. The bottom line is you just need to know that there are certain moves, regardless of whether you're playing in a faster or slower time control, there are certain moves where players will take a long time to make the move where they shouldn't be. It shouldn't be taking them that long, or they're obsessing over 2 moves that are virtually equal. And rather than just choose one and move on and save their time, they're obsessing, right? They're falling into the trap of perfectionism. So it's very important that you adapt to the time control. You don't want to play too slowly or too quickly, and you don't want to overdo it. So you might be used to a quick club control. And then if you play in a major weekend event, you think you have all the time in the world. And then again, you overcorrect. You need to be careful of that. Very, very important. So that will do it. That is our sort of top 10, or at least 10 of the most common reasons why people lose a chess game. So real quick, number 1 was focusing more on your own response than the move your opponent just made. Number 2 is when you rush after your opponent made an unconventional opening move. Number 3 is neglecting development. Number 4 is castling thoughtlessly or simply because you can, and also misplaying opposite side castling. Number 5 is moving a rook to the center or any file for no reason. You just kind of move it there just to move it. As I mentioned, occasionally as a waiting move, that's okay, but many players do this every game all the time and they miss other ideas. Number 6 is too much French pastry, the idea of getting too fancy and creating complications when you don't need to. Number 7 is a big one, trading down into a losing king and pawn ending. You simply trade pieces, but you don't analyze the aftermath once the pieces are gone. Number 8 is trying too hard to win, especially in a dead drawn position. Number 9 is losing your edge and sense of danger against low-rated opponents. There's a whole psychology to that there. And number 10 is not adapting to the time control that's in front of you, right? You can't play a game 60 the way you would play a 40 move in 2-hour game. But again, you need to be careful of not overcorrecting on either side of that. So a reminder, I will be taking the next 2 Sundays off, the 31st and the 7th. I'll be back with a new episode on April 14th, 2024. It's going to go by fast. Again, this will be a great time to binge and catch up. I really appreciate everyone listening. You guys are the best. And as always, and I'm changing this a little bit because I'm taking a few weeks off, I hope you win your next 5 games. All right. Have a great day, everybody.